Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on supply chain transparency and resilience, insights for sustainable retail. My name is Kayla Martins, and I'm manager of the Retail Compliance Center at RELA. Before we get started and introduce our speakers for today, we have a couple housekeeping items. Next slide. So everyone will be muted upon entry. This reduces background noise during our presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be housed on RELA's Retail Compliance Center site for future views. If you need to pose a question or comment, please use the Q&A box to pose those questions or comments. They will go directly to the moderators, which will be myself and two other RELA staff. Questions will be answered after the conclusion of our speaker's presentation. Next slide. Before we start, I want to remind everyone about the importance of antitrust compliance. Our goal is to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, so please avoid any discussion of prices, pricing policies, terms or conditions of doing business, or of course, any sort of market allocation. Also to be avoided is any discussion that might be perceived as suggesting that anyone should cease doing business with a particular supplier or customer, or any other discussion that might be viewed as coercive or exclusionary toward another company. If anyone feels uncomfortable about any subject or discussion or has any questions, please speak up and we will stop the conversation until we can provide legal guidance. Next slide. Next slide. So today we are lucky to hear from two great speakers. Oh, one slide back. First, I'll introduce Dr. Jamie Barsmantoff. Jamie received his doctorate in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz with a focus on environmental economics and resource management. He has extensive consulting and academic experience in sustainability, climate action strategy, responsible supply chains, and is a frequent speaker in academic and corporate venues. Before co-founding SupplyShift, he co-founded EcoShift Consulting, taught environmental economics and sustainable design at UC Santa Cruz, conducted nationwide research at the Urban Institute, and was a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama. Dr. Jamie Barsmantoff is the driving force behind connecting SupplyShift with its customers and partners and ensuring successful outcomes and continuous improvement in supply chain operations. We'll also hear from Dr. Kevin Dooley. Dr. Kevin Dooley is a professor of supply chain management and a Dean's Council of 100 Distinguished Scholars in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. He is Chief Scientist of the Sustainability Consortium, developing science and tools to improve the sustainability of consumer goods. Dr. Dooley is a world-known expert in the application of complexity science to help organizations improve. He has published over 100 research articles and co-authored an award-winning book, Organizational Change and Innovation Processes. He is on several journal editorial boards, including Journal of Supply Chain Management and Journal of Business Logistics. He has been awarded 2 patents on centering resonance analysis, a novel form of network tech analysis, and is co-founder and CEO of Crawdad Technologies, LLC, a provider of tech analysis software for academics of business at Arizona State University. So with that said, I will go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, and thank you all out there for joining us today on this very important topic of supply chain resiliency. So I'm going to kick us off to provide the context for what we mean by supply chain disruptions and what their impact is, and then setting up the necessity for us gaining supply chain transparency as we move towards a more resilient supply chain system. Next slide, please. So first of all, let's talk about the root causes of supply chain disruption. If we think about the delivery of a good or even a service from a supplier to a buyer, we know that the key issues is to get the right material or the right product to the right place at the right time and at the right cost. And so any event that gets in the way of achieving that goal, we could consider a type of disruption. And most of the everyday disruptions that we see to our production schedule, where we're expecting a supply on a truck coming in at 1 p.m. and it doesn't quite get there, these everyday failures are really systemic failures of the production and manufacturing and logistics systems. And anyone who's in manufacturing, could list 1,000 reasons for those micro disruptions that always occur in any complex supply network. But I think when we talk about resilience, we're thinking about larger scale events that may have larger impact, or may in fact impact multiple suppliers in a region or even across a globe, as we've seen with COVID. And so there, the root causes are things like natural disasters, like the Japanese tsunami, or the tornadoes or hurricanes that we see now more regularly. Suppliers simply going out of business or declaring bankruptcy due to any number of other root causes. Labor strikes or problems in achieving the labor capacity that we need. Geopolitical conflict, which can lead to anything from logistics challenges to border challenges to tariff challenges. And then finally, infrastructure and cyber failures, such as the problems that we saw with the California fires leading to power grid failures. The effect on buyers, whether it's a retailer or consumer packaged goods or a chemical company in the middle of the supply chain, are that these disruptions cause us to have less supply, or perhaps even no supply. It may be more costly, less timely. We may, in more severe situations, need to substitute suppliers, find new suppliers, or find additional supplier capacity. In many cases with publicly traded companies, a large-scale supply disruption will actually decrease their stock market value for a period of time. And if downstream consumers feel that the company itself is at the root of the cause of this failure, or that they did not do themselves well to prepare for it, there can be a loss of customer goodwill. Next slide. So let's get you going with a poll here. I believe, and Rila, yeah, oh, there's the poll that popped up. So this will help set a bit of context. So we're talking about supply disruptions and whether they occur due to your immediate first-tier suppliers, or they're actually farther upstream in your supply network. So how often do supply disruptions that you have, are these due to your immediate first-tier suppliers? Is that rarely? Most disruptions are in fact linked to your suppliers, your first-tier suppliers that you directly buy from. Or sometimes maybe it's not your suppliers, but it's their suppliers or their suppliers' suppliers. Or is it in the fact that most disruptions that you experience are not from your first-tier suppliers directly, but in fact from their extended supply chain? So we'll give you about another 30 seconds or so to respond to the poll, and then we'll see what pops up. All right, so we see that 77% of you responded that either sometimes or most of the time that disruptions are within your extended, what we would call really a supply network, right? So it's not really a chain, but it's a complex web of companies that form your supply network. And sometimes those failures are due to your first-tier suppliers, but often they're due to your supplier's suppliers. And so this sets the risk management context for our discussion, in that we have to be sensitive to supply disruptions that occur beyond our immediate first-tier supply chain. And we need to create an expectation that both we and our direct suppliers will help co-create transparency into that deeper supply chain, so that we can both attend to risks and really make connections with our far upstream suppliers to develop relationships. Next slide, please. So the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction provides this definition of resiliency, and I'll just highlight a few of the verbs here. It is to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover. So if any of you are risk management nerds like me, those words just resonate deeply with stuff that you love to talk about. And so our advocacy here is that all supply chain disruptions, whether they're due to production failures or natural disasters or something like COVID, or even into the future related to climate change, that these should not be managed separately, but they should be managed as part of your supply risk management function. Next slide. So there are two general strategies that buying companies use to create supply chain resiliency. And our heuristic here, our rule of thumb here is bridge when you can, buffer just in case. So bridging strategies, whether they're with your first tier suppliers or beyond, involves things like collaborating in inventory control and production planning. So connecting IT systems so that one sees more immediately increases and decreases in demand and supply and can take appropriate action. Financial support is a key issue, especially when we're talking about suppliers who need to invest in new business processes or even infrastructure or equipment in order to be resilient against a particular risk. Sometimes this financial support comes in direct investments, such as co-ownership. Other times, today, it's very common for us to see interest in a supply chain financing solution whereby a large buying organization provides essentially their interest rate and their risk coverage for a financial institution or system to provide low-cost loans for both cash flow and for capital expenditures to suppliers. And finally, and we've recently seen that in a project with Walmart and HBC, where HBC is providing supply chain financing based on suppliers' collaboration with Walmart around sustainability issues. And third, a final bridging strategy is to strengthen that relationship with the supplier. So it's one thing to have a name and address of who your critical supplier is, but it's another thing to have a relationship and so you can have trusting and honest and open conversations with them and indeed engage in trust-based collaboration. However, not everything can be managed through having strong suppliers. Often a supplier will fail due to no account of their capabilities or wherewithal. And so for that reason, we have buffers, whether in the form of inventory or additional capacity that we can bring online. We also have the potential to insure ourselves against liability. We can expect longer to get stuff and to deliver stuff down to our downstream customers. So that's a lead time buffer. And there are various ways in which we can buffer the cost implications of disruptions as well. Next slide, please. So there's a pathway from what we might call traceability or tracing to relating. And too often, we recognize that, in fact, technology is absolutely critical to create that traceability and transparency. But we also need the commitment of our management and top management to, in fact, also engage in developing relationships with our suppliers. And that gives us the best potential for resiliency. Here are two quick cases that are kind of famous in the literature talking about supply chain disruptions. So several decades ago, there was a fire in a supplier plant. That particular plant provided electrical components to two mobile phone makers, Nokia and Ericsson. And they approached this disruption in two different ways. Now I'll give away the story. The outcome is that Nokia came out I won't say smelling like roses, but they came out of this disruption fairly healthy. Ericsson, however, lost literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the market, and this caused a corporate level financial crisis just because of this single disruption. Now, Ericsson had excess inventory of this component that was supplied. So when they heard there was a fire, they were not as concerned because they thought, well, it'll take 3 or 4 weeks. We've got excess inventory, no problem. And so they didn't even immediately contact the factory and supplier. Nokia, however, had a deeper personal relationship with the supplier and immediately contacted the supplier and went about both assessing the amount of time it would take for the supplier to get back up, and then learning that it would take months and months. They went out and created a source of additional manufacturing capacity amongst their existing suppliers. Now, if you don't have traceability, if you don't even know where stuff is coming from, then you can't build anything. You're never going to have transparency or relationship if you don't have traceability. And the tsunami in Japan highlights a case of that, where there's a particular type of paint called Zerolac or Zeralic. And the picture there shows it's kind of metallic, really cool looking paint that you see on automobiles and other consumer goods. And it's been quite popular as a design feature over the last decade plus. The tsunami wiped out the plant, the single manufacturing plant in the entire globe that produced that particular paint. It wasn't until the tsunami actually occurred and that supply stopped showing up that the downstream automakers became aware that they were only depending on a single supplier. Next slide. So risks are place-based. And so you have to know where stuff is coming from, and then what are the risks that are associated with those particular regions. Here on the left, we see a map of, in this case, it's child labor risk for regions that are supplying cocoa to the United States manufacturers. And we see, for example, in the upper right picture, that within particular countries like Ghana or the Ivory Coast, that if we look at both the production volume that's supplied by different regions and the risk of child labor in those regions, it gives us a very specific notion of where we may have suppliers that are high risk or relatively lower risk. And the challenge is that commodities like cocoa or coffee or sugar are particularly challenging to even trace. And so at the Sustainability Consortium, we created some tools called commodity mapping that allow a company to, first of all, understand where production regions are for the commodity that they're sourcing, and then where their supply chain, whether they have proprietary data or we need to rely on kind of trade data, where their supply is likely coming from. Next slide. So the Sustainability Consortium, we're probably best known for creating and being steward of the Walmart Sustainability Index, which is now called Thesis. And this runs on the SupplyShift platform that we'll hear more about in a little bit. And SupplyShift, having a common platform for suppliers to report sustainability performance allows a many-to-many reporting system, which creates efficiencies. What the consortium has done with our corporate and NGO members is create a materiality assessment by looking at published science to identify environmental and social hotspots, and then working with those business stakeholders to develop key performance indicators for different product categories. And as of last year, over 1,500 suppliers with retailers like Walmart and Kroger and Sprouts made assessments representing $1 trillion in annual sales. Now, over on the right is some data around what we see in our KPIs. What is the level of transparency into your own operations, into supplier practices? we see that number has increased a bit from 2016 to 17 to 18. Now, those don't look like big percentage increases, but that's over 1,500 suppliers. If we dig a little bit deeper and look at some particular categories like apparel, hand tools, plastic products, plastic toys, and we look at the average supplier transparency scores. So this is, if you're a plastic product company, manufacturer, what transparency do you have into your supplier's sustainability operations? That we see those who have only participated in the index and really engaging in these types of measurements for 1 year have a far lower rate of transparency than the average score of suppliers who have participated 5 years. So we see that, you know, it takes 2 or 3 years for a company from the time that they say, yes, we want to gain transparency into our suppliers' operations, and then you actually begin to see data that you first need to establish that traceability. You need to establish the systems that allow transparency to be easily communicated in a trustworthy way. And then, of course, over time, where it's critical and value, you develop relationships with those critical suppliers. Next slide. So how has the pandemic been different than typical supply chain disruptions? Well, there's a lot of disruptions all happening at once. It's been very long lasting. There's been demand shifting, which is very interesting. So we hear about like the toilet paper or the food in restaurants and hotels, where those supply chains have been so optimized for their final channel that there's little opportunity to shift, let's say, paper products from a B2B channel to a B2C channel. And this has led to both increases and decreases in demand. So typically we see a disruption, you know, the demand remains constant, the supply is a problem. But here the disruptions also impacted demand in both directions. And whereas we often see a disruption only focused on suppliers or manufacturers, this particular pandemic has caused disruptions to the whole value chain, suppliers, workers, customers. So some of the lessons learned from this are that we pay a price for optimizing or maximizing the value from supply chains for a particular purpose. And to the extent that we can decrease the asset specificity needed by downstream B2B users or the B2C market, this allows us more flexibility in meeting the demand that's there when we have disruptions to supply. We've learned that, you know, we know historically that supply chains are measured on how lean they are. Things like inventory turns are critical to how a supply chain manager is evaluated and how a company measures its performance. If we want resilience, we're going to have to figure out ways to integrate metrics for resilience into the performance metrics that companies and supply chains and managers use to evaluate their performance. We've learned that buffers can only take you so far. We had about 3 to 4 weeks of inventory buffer in the United States for most assets, but that was about it. And from there, it depended on the capacity that we had in that March to April timeframe. And finally, this discussion has brought up questions around, should U.S. companies, for example, you know, de-risk by moving out of China or something like that? In my observation, there were some companies that were already talking about moving out of China for reasons that had nothing to do with the pandemic. And then in general, what we need for resiliency is geographic diversity. So whether or not we pull out of a particular country is a different decision. The key here is that if we only have production facilities or suppliers in a single geographic region, we're facing a risky proposition. Next slide. How could climate change be like what we see today? Well, climate change is going to induce some of the same risks that we see from COVID, more frequent, severe, and longer disruption durations, supply chains and more or disruptions in more places, and even structural transitions like in food and forestry, where growing regions may shift from one region to another. One of the things that we discovered in the paper, or the report that we put together with HSBC on supply chain resilience over there on the right, is that also climate change will focus investor attention more on supply chain decarbonization because of the future risk of a carbon tax or something similar, and that buyer-supplier contracts will focus more on force majeure issues as we argue about whether climate change risks are foreseeable or not. Next slide. I want to leave you with a great list of how to be a resilient supply chain and in general a high reliability organization from the brilliant work of the University of Michigan scholars Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe. They studied high reliability systems that were under constant hazard. An aircraft carrier is kind of the exemplar of that, where you basically have a small landing field that's moving up and down on waves and in weather, and you're staffing it with 22-year-olds many of whom have never spent any time even in an airport. And that even in these kind of high-risk systems, there are processes and values and culture that can be created that makes one resilient to failure. Being preoccupied with failure as part of your everyday operational controls, being reluctant to simplify interpretations, being sensitive to operations. So we see that companies that have great risk management in their operations also have great risk management to all the other types of risks the company might face. They're committed to resilience, and they defer to experts. And I'll leave it to you to look at this list and see how our companies and regions and country reaction to COVID has gone here. But if we can create a culture that really highlights these as foundational, we'll do the right tactical things to be resilient. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I'm going to start in now. Next slide, please. For the second segment, I'm Jamie Barsimanto with SupplyShift. Talking today about more about transparency and resilience and sustainability. If we skip to the punchline, I've been saying for years that sustainability, responsibility, transparency, and resilience, these should all be one word. And we're going to look at what's happened kind of pre-COVID, post-COVID, what's going on with data from the SupplyShift network, where retailers and suppliers are exchanging information about a range of issues. And I think that's finally happening. I think that's the punchline, is that due to COVID, these words are finally becoming synonymous to some degree in the eyes of procurement staff and sustainability teams. Next slide. So I'm going to cover three areas, a little bit about COVID-19 and supply chain transparency and kind of how we see companies shifting as far as their approaches to transparency in the age of COVID, how that has changed companies' approaches on climate change and also climate change in general, and what retailers and brands are doing to address the massive issue we have, as well as to meet the targets that they've set. And finally, and probably most importantly, is the retail network that we have on SupplyShift that Kevin referred to, the Thesis Index, which was designed specifically for retailers to measure the sustainability hotspots in the products that they sell. So we'll look a little bit about that and some of the data that we've pulled from that in last year's reporting. Next slide. Tiny bit of background about what SupplyShift is. It's a responsible supply chain network, multi-tier network designed for companies to interact with their first-tier suppliers, to map back as many tiers as needed down the chain. The benefits of this are clearly that a company has a mechanism to engage with their suppliers in numerous ways. But the benefit of the network is really that quicker time to data, relieving that survey fatigue, having the ability to benchmark both within and outside a company's supply chain, all based on common data, where companies can choose what to collect and suppliers can choose who to share it with. So that's what SupplyShift is. We'll talk about a couple of key things that we've done recently that are relevant to this topic today. Next slide. We're talking about global results and global scale. Over 80,000 entities are on the platform, have provided data to their customers in 133 countries where suppliers have logged in. Next slide. So we'll have this slide about pre-COVID and then some reflections on what's changed and some data to explore that a little bit. We've been doing this a long time. It's been about 8 years since we started SupplyShift. And you've got a lot of companies that are really passionate about sustainability and have a really hard time funding the initiatives that are really going to drive change. I mean, I think anyone would agree with that. I think it's still somewhat the same, but it's shifted. So pre-COVID world, right? Sustainability is siloed from the broader business, right? It's a focus on specific issues, specific commodities. It's not really a transparency initiative. It's not really, how do we slowly gain more and more information, more and more engagement with our suppliers? It's more like, wow, how do we address this plastics problem that's in the news today? So that's how things were. And transparency is a nice to have. If I could have a little more transparency, that'd be great. But maybe I won't be able to pay for it, or maybe that information is not getting through the business in the best way to really get the value out of it. So generally, companies making progress on sustainability, but too slow, right? Next slide. So post-COVID, all these bullets I think are summed up by one conversation that I had with a procurement manager who was charged with basically making more masks in a time of COVID, right? Immediate urgency to create a lot more product and also dealing with the disruptions, right? And so when we go through SupplyShift, there's the mapping going down multiple tiers. He's like, if I just had that map now, things would be different. I would be planning differently. I would have a better way to address the issue and plan for the issue and take advantage of the situation, to do more if that transparency was available, right? So this means that, I think, I'll skip to the third bullet, right? Maybe you guys are reading along while I'm talking. Sustainability tenets taken up by procurement, right? The things that we've been saying and sustainability professionals have been saying, that if you have a more sustainable supply chain, you've got a more transparent supply chain. If you've got a more responsible supply chain, you've got a more resilient supply chain. I hear procurement staff now saying those things back to us, saying we need that level of transparency. If we knew more, and sometimes folks say, yeah, we want multi-tier transfer. We want to map. And I say, what do you actually want to know? And sometimes they have specific things, but more often today, what I'm hearing is we're not sure yet. We just need to know who's who. Because when that thing comes up, then we'll be able to react better. So that's how I think the world has changed based on what's happened with the COVID-19 crisis. In addition, and we'll get to this later, investors have not let up on ESG. They haven't said, oh, poor companies dealing with COVID, don't worry about all those commitments about climate change and plastics, and you don't worry about that for now. Actually, I think it's the reverse. They're saying, now that everyone's worried about supply chains, you better be worried about your supply chain for a lot of things. So I think that hasn't changed and maybe even increased. Next slide, please. Here's a poll. Has COVID-19 prompted your organization to put more focus on supply chain transparency? Yes or no, or we're already focused on supply chain transparency. Let us know. Click on one of those and we'll have some results. I'll just keep going in before we go to the next slide. We'll wait for the poll results to come in. One thing that we did, and this is where we're going to get to some data in a minute, is that when COVID-19 struck, a lot of our customers said, hey, well, we got to hold off a little bit. We're distracted. We said, why don't we launch a COVID-19 impact assessment and make it no cost? So companies can map back multiple tiers, ask a basic question set about, did you have a disruption? Are you have less workers? Are things going to open up soon or not? Make that a way that companies can engage their supply chain. So we offered that at no cost. It's actually still available at no cost. And now we have some results. So let's first look at the results of this poll. Yeah, so we've got basically, more or less in thirds. A third say yes, a third say no, a third say we're already focused on supply chain transparency. So I guess that's about what we'd expect, right? We just say some companies are reacting more, some companies haven't changed, and some are already doing it, right? So yeah, I think generally that's this little poll validates I think what we just we're talking about. So next slide. So this kind of what does COVID tell us about transparency? This was really echoed by Big Four consultants and so on, right? Basically, this is COVID-19 has increased the need for transparency at multiple tiers for risk mitigation and so on. So that's next slide, please. So we launched this COVID-19 impact assessment. 10 questions. Where are you? What was the impact? We had a bunch of companies take that up immediately. Now, this isn't super interesting at tier 1, right? Key suppliers, were they impacted? You probably would know that pretty quickly, right? I think the value here is beyond tier 1, is when companies can start to understand, oh, I see, I've got some impacts at tier 2 and tier 3. I think that's the real innovation here about this one, rather than calling up your supplier and saying, are you open for business or not? So let's look at some results that we saw there. Next slide. So looking at operational capacity and what percent are they open, do see that most suppliers, a little less than half are 100%. Yeah, a little less than half are almost 100% open. Some of them are more than 100% open. And I think, you can look at that and say, wow, pretty good. Folks are open. I think what's actually interesting is where they're closed, right? And that's really what you want to, that's those hot spots that need to be addressed, and also reasons for shutdown, right? And that can help understand when things might open back up again. Next slide. A little more information there about percent of employees that are unavailable. Do you expect disruptions to increase or decrease? Again, overall, I think the news is, you could say, positive, right? That a lot of companies have 0% of employees unavailable. A lot of them have, we're looking at 67% together have, less than 10% of employees unavailable. But really what folks are worried about is those smaller wedges where there are some serious disruptions. So I think, again, the data is not, I'd say, wildly different from what we might expect. I think what's interesting is how folks are reacting to the need for that kind of data, right? So next slide. ESG taking center stage, right? We see this time and time again in the investor community that it's not, I'll just read this one from BlackRock. I think it's particularly interesting. The pandemic we're experiencing now highlights the fragility of the globalized world and the value of sustainable portfolios. We've seen sustainable portfolios deliver stronger performance than traditional portfolios during this period. And I'll read the other one too, because I think these are fascinating. Companies should expect more investors to ask questions about resilience and contingency planning, viewing the issues in light of the pandemic as relevant to a company's long-term performance. Down the line, those conversations should evolve to the broader ESG discussions, right? So resilience, transparency, responsibility, sustainability, this is really the moment in time when these things now become the same thing. It's all about engagement with suppliers. It's all about information. It's the more you know about who your suppliers are and what they're doing across the range of issues that matter and have a central place to manage that information, the stronger you're going to be, the more responsive you're going to be to investors. Next slide. Let's transition to climate change. Oh, poll, sorry. Does your company view climate risk mitigation as an aspect of business resilience, right? So let's see where you guys land here as far as this basic yes or no question. And meanwhile, I'll just start transitioning while you're clicking on something. We'll transition to the next area where we're going to talk about climate change. Pre-COVID, climate change was probably the biggest crisis we were talking about. That crisis hasn't changed in any way. We just are distracted. And you still see companies setting science-based greenhouse gas targets. That's over 350 companies have set those targets. Hundreds more are in the process of setting science-based targets. And a science-based target is a greenhouse gas reduction target that is in line with what the world needs to meet this crisis and have enough reduction. That's what we're going to talk about next. Right now, yeah, we'll see really strong confirmation that 83% of you all think that climate risk mitigation is an aspect of business resilience, right? So these things are becoming one, and as they become one, managing them in a central way is how you actually get the value out of that. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. So science-based targets, you know, they're expanding in by leaps and bounds. Many companies are in the process of figuring out what their target should be. Big push from the investor community to set those targets. And then the challenge becomes, how do you meet that target? How do you reduce that very high percentage of greenhouse gas emissions? And there are many levers to do that. None of them are easy. They involve, you know, changing what you sell, replacing materials, encouraging suppliers to do the energy efficiency that they can, to you know, switch to renewable energies where they can. All those things that are going to reduce emissions at every touch point possible. So what we say at SupplyShift is that different segments of the economy need to understand different things about their supply chains and about the products they sell, about climate change. In some cases, for example, you know, in the services type suppliers or vendors, have you set a target or not? Are you reducing? When it comes to products, right, retail and the products you sell, we believe that in the not too distant future, there are going to be much more powerful information available to consumers as consumers demand more and more understanding. So next slide, please. The thesis index, which Kevin referred to, this was originally initiated by Walmart over 10 years ago to help create the Sustainability Consortium as a multi-stakeholder consortium to identify what the sustainability hotspots are across every product category on a retailer's shelf, develop standardized assessment methodologies for every product category on a retailer's shelf, and then deliver insights to those retailers, deliver action plans to these suppliers, and really get that whole system available. So starting a year and a half ago, that whole measurement framework was transitioned to SupplyShift from an SAP system. And we've expanded that significantly. Now we have not only Walmart, but Walgreens, Sprouts, Kroger, Sam's Club. We have 4 retailers, food service companies in the EU who are also using the Thesis network. And that just means that there's more benchmarking, more suppliers have already done this and can just resubmit to their retailers. So this is becoming the de facto way to measure responsibility at the product category level, which not only measures towards a retailer's goals, but also provides the kind of insight that can, in the not too distant future, and the Sustainability Consortium is working on this, how do you get this stuff to be, communicate this well to a consumer, this really complex information. So let's look a little bit about what the thesis index is, and then let's look at some data. Next slide, please. Actually, we're going to start with some data. What we find here is when you ask suppliers to retailers whether they have a commitment to reduce and disclose their Scope 3 emissions, their upstream supply chain emissions, you got about a quarter of them have done that, have goals and are tracking Scope 3. About a quarter haven't done that, but they know their suppliers are measuring emissions, and about half haven't done that at all, right? So there's still a ways to go. But there is a lot of rich information that is being provided, and we'll get to that in a second. A little bit about what the thesis index is and how it works. Next slide, please. It lives within the SupplyShift network, so we have retailers who are doing thesis, but also using SupplyShift for different topics and issues with their suppliers. It allows a brand to respond to any KPI set and then submit to any of their customers. They choose who they submit it to. No one gets to see who sells to who. A brand or a contract manufacturer, private label supplier chooses who they sell to and can track their performance. So let's take a brief look. Next slide, please. First thing they do is it's all supplier driven. They pick the product categories. This drills them down. If they pick produce, they're going to eventually pick grapes and cherries and peaches or whatever it is, and have a performance assessment about each of those. Next slide, please. What they get back once they do the process, I think this is critical in any supplier responsibility engagement, is giving them something back, right? Something that they can use to take action. So this is an example, product category, tomatoes and tomatillos. There are 15 KPIs. You can see a couple on the left side there. There's 15 KPIs. Their overall score is here. Their rank compared to their peers within that retailer, across the whole thesis network, their position, and then there's action recommendations. If you were to scroll down here, you'd see for each of those KPIs, they get their score, their rank, their position, and action recommendations. So it's really a sustainability benchmarking and toolkit program for them for every single product category that they sell to all their customers. Next slide, please. And on the buyer side, there's a whole range of tools to slice and dice, right? They get all access to the data that's been submitted. Well, we're not going to go into detail here, just to let you know it's a full-fledged system. Next slide. So what do we learn? Specifically about greenhouse gases, this is kind of a hot topic. We're about to publish a report based on 2019 reporting. I'm just going to cover a couple of the results here as we wrap up. So this is not the individual product categories, because, for example, within prepared foods, there are subcategories within that. But if we aggregate at a couple levels up into these categories that are here, this is asking the brands or the contract manufacturers of the supply that you sell to the retailer, how much was produced by suppliers who are reporting their scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? So this is about the brand's suppliers, right? How much do they know about that? And we'll see that generally more than half, right, is of them do have greenhouse gas reporting of their next tier suppliers, which is, I think, pretty impressive to know that that data is out there. Next slide. And then the next set of questions about greenhouse gases go into the manufacturing intensity, right? So if you're manufacturing t-shirts, can you tell me across the supply that you sell me, what is the greenhouse gas intensity of those t-shirts? And so a retailer can compare greenhouse gas intensity across all of their suppliers in this way. And we can see a really big range across the product categories of which categories are able to report that manufacturing greenhouse gas intensity, and which of them say, I don't know. So this is an area, obviously, where there's lots of improvement, but you can imagine that companies, the retailers, use this data in much different ways to incentivize change, to understand where they're at, to do their inventories, et cetera, et cetera. Just about to wrap up here. Next slide, please. Some takeaways. What 2019, 2020 has been a big year. What do we learn from the 2019 data? How's that, 2020, all that's happened with COVID? What do we learn from all this? First, supply chain transparency and responsibility are cross-cutting more than ever, right? It should be seen as one thing. That's going to really be what integrates this into business practice. Number 2, suppliers respond well to standardized approaches. We saw suppliers proactively responding to customers who didn't even ask them, because I did all this work to compile these results across product categories. I want to share those, right? So suppliers like standardized approaches. The retail network is growing. We have several more that are coming on board this year as well. Number 4, measure what matters, right? Transparency, traceability, sustainability, these are very general terms. For each company, there are material issues and there are methodologies to measure each one of those, because you're not the first to experience that. Number 5, set procurement benchmarks. Set thresholds, incentivize action. When a supplier sees their score and they see their score compared to their peers, that motivates improvement, because no one wants to be in last place. Last one, communicate progress to your consumers, right? I think that's where there's a lot of room to grow, both on the technology side as well as on the maturity of companies. The data now is something that we have ready to feed into those systems. Now the next phase of this big journey, this big global journey of sustainability and transparency, is what's the best way to communicate this to consumers? We learned that consumers don't love checkboxes. They don't love certifications. They're not meaningful enough. They're not comparable across products. There is rich data, but it's too complicated, right? So how do we distill now what we know and is housed within global systems? How do we use that to communicate appropriately? I think that's really the next phase of the journey. Next slide. Just to let you guys know, we had such good response from our COVID-19 no-cost starter assessment that we deployed one for greenhouse gases. We said, why don't we have a simple way for companies to ask their suppliers, do you measure? Do you have a target? Do you plan to set a target? And have you reduced in the last year? And do you have initiatives? Basic stuff. Anyone should be able to answer that immediately. And we're going to start sharing back now the results we learned from that. While we're helping buyers and suppliers learn where they're at and manage their own issues, we also want to be more proactive and share this out with the world. Next and last slide. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And I believe we have about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you for both Kevin and Jamie for sharing. We really appreciated your insight today. We'll jump right into the Q&A. If you haven't submitted your questions already, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. I'll start with the first question, and I believe this is directed towards Dr. Dooley, but please feel free to jump in if it applies to either of you. The first question is, if you could explain why it is hard to trace commodities.
Sure. So I'll start with an example. If you look at trade data, you might infer that Germany is the largest grower of coffee beans in the world. And it's because Germany has situated itself as a key distributor through the coffee supply chain. And so very often commodities are aggregated by distributors and resellers. And it's often the case that because physically the commodity is intermixed as it's handled and shipped, that one can only at best use a type of accounting approach, what's called a mass balance approach, to account for particular commodities that come from a particular place or have a particular attribute. So for example, palm oil, generally sustainably grown palm oil, which is certified as such, is not necessarily distributed and shipped and whatnot in separate containers and through a separate supply chain. That's different, for example, than if you looked at organic beef versus non-organic beef, where not only is there a separate supply chain for organic versus non-organic, but the cattle are literally raised in different areas. So for example, the organic cattle cannot be exposed to antibiotics. And so in some cases we do have proprietary supply chains where traceability is possible, but for commodities, because of that intermixing and because of the huge role that distributors and aggregators and resellers play, it often is lacking. And this could be down to very, very basic fundamental stuff, such as the distributor, might not really have a modern ERP system. And so even within its own operations, it might have low visibility into where stuff is coming from.
I would just add from the kind of, we've seen companies take on mapping their supply chain in different ways. The folks who try to map through those really difficult to trace commodity supply chains, software-wise, we can do it. Physically, I don't think it's worth it because first of all, it's hard to do. And you get these global commodity traders, first of all, they can't even tell you where your soybeans come from. Your soybeans, maybe globally they're soybeans. But then why would you trace if they're just gonna tell you their global supply? More importantly, it's changing all the time. So by the time you go through that hard work to map back, it's probably changed. There is value in knowing where your sources are and right sizing your mapping and tracing programs to supply chains that are shorter, that are more material commodities, where you have collaboration, where there are specific issues you want to address. So tracing is different than assessing, right? So identifying where are key nodes that are important and assessing those nodes can happen at the same time or independently, but it's definitely a challenging area.
In the thesis scores, we see that a number of the categories that represent fruit and vegetables, which for most US-based or North American-based retailers, fruits and vegetables would be grown either in the US or potentially Mexico or some countries in South America. So these are shorter supply chains. Retailers often have direct proprietary relationships with growers. But we also think in these cases, the traceability and transparency has been high because of regulatory mechanisms. And so fruit and vegetables have to be traceable by US law because of outbreaks of disease and whatnot. And so there's been that investment in the information systems to enable that.
Thank you both for the response to that. That's great. I think we'll have time for maybe one more question here. We had a question come in about the cottage industry. They're just being introduced to that. They wanted to know, how would we ensure social accountability with this type of industry, since it's not a normal factory, but it's rather someone's home or several homes? Can either of you speak to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in there.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, and you could expand that question, right, to a highly mechanized large farm in the U.S. versus a 2-acre coffee farm in El Salvador, right? These are much different mechanisms and much different expectations that you should have about what information they're able to provide and what kind of burden you should put on them. It's all about right sizing and using a risk-based approach, right? So know a little bit about who you're trying to address. If it is, a tiny factory, call it a factory, right? That's in someone's house, you probably need a different approach. There's probably a lot of them in your supply chain. So you probably need to understand, okay, I'll just go through a scenario, right? So there's 100 of these in Thailand in my supply chain, and there's probably another 200 of these in China in my supply chain. Okay, so what are the risks about China and Thailand that are different? Okay, so that's one. You're gonna slice out something. I'm worried about one of these issues. I'll focus on Thailand versus the other one. You go to Thailand, there's 100 of them. Okay, so, well, first of all, who are they and where are they? Can you get to that level of information? There's probably some aggregator in between, right? So you're gonna have to engage them to get that kind of information. Once you're at that point, then it's about how much effort and time and money do you spend to probably go visit those places, right? You're probably not gonna send them an online survey. You're probably gonna have, okay, there's 100 of them, I'm gonna pick 10. I'm gonna go see what the issues are. I'm gonna learn a little bit about the issues based on those 10, and then I'm gonna design a mitigation strategy. And that I learned there's an issue. If there's an issue in all 10 of them, it's probably in all 100 of them, right? So then you have a mitigation strategy that's gonna, you know what the issue is, and then you go address it, come back the next year, go to the same 10, go to a different 10, right? Something like that. So it's all about following the process all the way through and taking the information that you have to design a right-sized approach that's data-driven, that gets all your information in one place that you can build on and you can track.
Great, thank you. So we are running out of time here. As we're coming to an end, those listening in, you'll notice some poll questions did pop up on the screen. If you could take 30 seconds to let us know how you thought the webinar went, we would greatly appreciate it. I want to take this time to thank Dr. Dooley and Dr. Bachmantoff for joining us today and sharing such valuable insight. For those listening in, we will send out a follow-up email with the recording and also any other information that they have. If you have any additional questions or your question was not answered from our speakers today, feel free to reach out to me or our speakers directly, and they would be glad to answer that. So we'll keep this open for the polls for a little bit, but thank you to all who have provided feedback already. And that concludes our webinar today. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to our audience, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.